So how did your first FD role come about?
Oh my God, my first FD role came about because so when I was at Kia Cars, the gentleman who was in the role at the time, a guy called Peter Halliday, the business was in a pretty rough state at the time as the Korean Southeast Asian market crash and everything else at the time. And he ended up leaving.
Yeah.
And there was this vacant hole that was created. And because of circumstances for Peter, it came around and it just materialized in front of me. So I was actually on my way out the door for another job when the opportunity presented itself.
So what kind of stage were you at in your career at that point? I mean, how old were you? How many years in like post qualification?
So I was 28, somewhere in my late 20s.
Yeah.
Post qual, about 2 or 3 years.
Yeah. And was Kia your first kind of post qual job, or had you been somewhere else before?
I was somewhere very briefly, as in like 3 or 4 months prior to Kia. So effectively, Kia was my first real role post qualification.
So that's really good to have like come in somewhere, worked there for whatever it was, 3 years, and then be in a position to take up the FD role. What did you do in that time that actually impressed them so much that they wanted to make you FD?
So I knew all of the senior leadership team within Kia in the capacity as commercial analyst. Effectively, was the role. It was a slightly more glorified business analyst role, more business partner, right? More
Yeah,
finance business partner orientated. So you,
yeah,
you get to know everyone, you build relationships with everybody, you help communicate, you help them understand the numbers, also build some really interesting relationships with people outside the senior leadership team
yeah,
who have been around for a while, know the business. So everybody kind of knew me, everybody kind of spoke to me, everybody. And I think it's just the case of the way that I worked was just to make it easy for people, easy,
yeah,
especially for the leadership team, which was just really just to understand what was going on. So a lot of it was most people knew me. It's the old know, like, and trust, right? I think that at the
yeah.
end of the day, rather than anything technically or anything accounting orientated or finance orientated, I think a lot of it was quite a shock when Peter left. It was a real challenging time with the Korean economy the way it was, and so it was a safe pair of hands is not necessarily the way I was at, but I think having someone who the Japanese shareholder knew, the Korean manufacturer knew, the leadership team knew, and who would come in and just do a good job, I
Yeah.
think was a lot of the thinking at the time, because I knew Mark Quinn, who was the MD of Kia at the I knew him
Mm.
as in talking to and working with and everything else, but I wouldn't say that I knew him,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
So he knew what I was capable of, but as someone who worked with Peter Halliday, who was the FD, and within the group's finance team in the role as, let's say, business partner to Kia, I think everybody knew who I was, knew what I did, knew what I could do, and in that respect, knew what I was capable of.
and that came from knowing people, and I think it's maybe a kind of a misunderstandable phrase, like I got the job because I knew people. It was because of who I knew. It's like, oh, it goes back to it's not what you know, it's who you know.
No,
It's
not that
not
way.
quite what it's not quite what you're saying, is it? It's like they knew you as something. They knew you
Yeah,
as a safe pair of hands, a good person who understood the business and knew how they worked and how you could help them. I think that's something people have got to bear in mind. It's not just who you know; it's kind of what you're known as to those people.
yes.
Yeah,
And I think that for me that's always been the horse, right? For me, but the horse brought the cart. That's always been the horse for me, is to build good relationships, be known for who I am and the value I deliver,
yeah,
and then and from that point bring my technical and finance skills to the table. But it's more about building that relationship with that individual that enabled them to actually then go, okay, I know the person I'm sitting with, I trust the person I'm sitting with, I trust the information that I'm being given enables me to make the decision.
mm.
and in that way work together. Because I think
Mm.
the way it had been done before was effectively I basically, from a numbers perspective, tell you how it needs to work
Yeah.
without building the relationship first. And I'm like, that's nothing worse than going to very big, hairy automotive salesman, yeah,
Yeah.
and saying to them, I'm going to tell you, I'm a 28-year-old who's going to tell you how to do your job. That's not the way it works, right? So it is about relationships, getting to know them, and then getting to understand who I am, the way I work, the value I bring, and how that can enable them, rather than going, well, I'm the finance man in the room, and therefore, because it's numbers, I know best.
Yeah. So you kind of got that mutual respect of they respect your knowledge of the numbers, you respect their knowledge of car sales and
Yeah, of the business, of
of the
their
business.
business, right? I think also that's part of the then helping them understand the numbers, right?
Mm.
So they can make decisions. This is how it is. This is what is important. This is what's good. This is what where the line's drawn. But this is why it's drawn here, and this is what the objective is from a finance perspective. So everybody buys into the objective at the end of it.
And it is more about relationships, isn't it? Because what I used to find was actually some of the technical stuff, like the stuff we talk about in the numbers, isn't that difficult.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like we're doing anything technically baffling and mind blowing and magical. They may think it is.
Yeah,
So it is more about the relationship building and the business knowledge.
I think so. And if I'm honest about one thing, Andy, I would say I've been very lucky in my career, and I would say that pretty much every senior finance role I've done in the last 20 years, I've always followed someone who isn't relationship based. So in
Yeah.
that way, I think and that for me in my own career for 20 odd years has shown to me that actually, given the way I've followed in behind someone else in that way, but also I've seen when they've gone back to very technically strong but not relationship strong finance directors and everything else who have followed me, the disruption that it causes or the value that seems to be lost is very real. I think we get hung up on you need to be technically competent, right? You need to know what you need to know, right? Or no, and if you don't know what you need to know, you need to definitely know someone who has your back and
Yeah, yeah,
knows
yeah.
it, right?
Yeah.
But I think the biggest skill, so the biggest skills for me are the ability one to communicate, and we talk about keeping everything very very simple. I think it's being able to relay what you're trying to present, get across in a way that the person opposite you understands. It doesn't matter how you understand it, is it
Yeah.
can you communicate it so the person who's opposite you understands it and can relate it back to you in a way that makes sense to you. So you might not think, you might not look at the orange the same way, but you're definitely both looking at the same orange, right? I think
Yeah.
that for me that is much more powerful a skill as a CFO, as an FD, than being the most technical person in the room.
But one last question before I let you get back to your next board bond biscuit. Um, those relationship building skills, how do you think you developed those? Was that a conscious thing? Did you like get qualified and think, I've got to develop communication skills, or I've got to develop good relationships, and how am I going to do that? And did you go on like a relationship building course or anything like that? I mean, how does that happen?
Well, some of it is just who I am. Okay.
Yeah.
However, I think the one thing I became aware of quickly, I think, especially in the work environment, was whilst I am a nice person, a good person, right,
You are.
there is still the need for me to work on my skills
Mm,
and improve my communication.
mm,
And I suppose I did this the hard way, right? Because that's all about coal face, learning at the coal face, getting the feedback and taking the feedback on board and improve it and changing the way I communicate or the way I work and everything else, but
mm,
not trying to lose who I am. What
mm.
I've done latterly in my career is I have a coach.
Right.
So therefore, for me, 30 years later, 20 years later,
Yeah.
right, I have a coach, and a lot of what we talk about is, well, in terms of business is one thing, but the business only goes where I go. So therefore,
Mm,
let's talk about me and how it works for me and how I show
yeah,
up and how I communicate. Um, so now I have someone who is able to give me that feedback more formally.
yeah,
And I think if I could have done, and to be fair, I think I've been lucky in the sense that I had, in particular, two CEOs who I've worked with over the last 20 years,
yeah.
who have understood me and have given me good feedback.
Mm,
If you can find that intentionally,
yeah.
it accelerate things so much more.
It's kind of about having a bit of humility, or if not humility, a teachability. And I think it's genuinely those people who recognize they have lots to learn
Mm-hmm.
that actually learn it and actually grow.
I do tend to agree with you, and I think the earlier we find out a few things about ourselves and what works for us,
Yeah.
and then we're able to show up in a way that works for us, I think the better.